The bullet hadn't killed him. That was the first thing Emmeline Holt noticed when the stranger rode into Reed Rock Crossing on a Tuesday in late October. The way he sat his horse like a man who had been shot and survived it, careful and slightly crooked, his left shoulder riding lower than his right, as if the memory of the wound still lived in the muscle. He wore a duster the color of old rust, a hat pulled low against the afternoon sun, and he didn't look at anyone when he dismounted outside Cardwell's general store. He looked at the ground. He looped his horse's reins around the post with the quiet economy of someone who had done it 10,000 times and walked inside without a word. Emmeline watched from across the street, where she had been arguing with Deputy Haas about the property line on her family's eastern pasture. She forgot what she had been saying. She forgot the property line entirely. She just watched the door swing shut behind the stranger and felt something stir in her chest that she hadn't felt in a long time, something between curiosity and recognition, though she had never seen this man before in her life. "Miss Holt," Deputy Haas was staring at her. "Sorry," she said, turning back. "Sorry, you were saying about the survey markers." But her eyes drifted back to Cardwell's door before she could stop them. The stranger's name, she would learn by sundown, was Rafael Vega. He was 31 years old. He had ridden in from the direction of Santa Fe, alone, with a bedroll, a rifle, 2 saddlebags, and no explanation for why he had come to a town like Reed Rock Crossing, the kind of place people left rather than arrived at. The town sat in a shallow red basin between 2 mesa ridges in the New Mexico Territory in the year 1882. It had a post office, a saloon, a church, 12 families, 37 cattle ranches of varying fortune, 1 schoolhouse, and more dust than God intended to place in any single valley. Emmeline Holt was 24 years old, the eldest daughter of a cattleman, and she had been running her father's ranch on her own since he suffered a bad fall from his horse 18 months ago. She was tall for a woman of her era, brown-skinned from sun and wind, with dark hair she kept in a practical braid and eyes the color of sage along the creek bed. She had once been engaged to a man named Thomas Garrett, who rode south to settle a land dispute and never came back. The town had opinions about this. Emmeline did not discuss it. She finished her conversation with Deputy Haas, walked to her horse, and told herself not to look at Cardwell's store again. She looked anyway. The stranger, Rafael Vega, had come back out onto the porch, a paper bag of supplies tucked under his good arm, and he was looking directly at her, not the way men in Reed Rock Crossing usually looked at her, with that particular mixture of pity about Thomas and speculation about the ranch. He looked at her the way a man looks at a horizon he has been riding toward for a long time and is only now beginning to understand. Steady, like he was trying to memorize something. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds before she looked away. Her heart was doing something embarrassing, and she did not appreciate it. She rode home without looking back. Her father, James Holt, was sitting on the porch when she returned to the ranch, wrapped in a blanket even though the air was only mildly cool. His right leg had healed badly from the fall, and he walked with a cane now, slowly, and on bad days he did not walk at all. He was 60 years old and he looked 70, but his eyes were still sharp and he missed very little. "Heard a stranger rode in today," he said, before she had even tied her horse. "News travels fast," she said. "This is Reed Rock Crossing," he said. "News travels before it happens." She unsaddled the horse herself, rubbed him down, and came to sit on the steps below her father. The evening was coming in purple and gold over the western mesa, the way it always did here, like a painting someone repainted every single night and never got tired of. She had grown up watching this sky, and she still wasn't used to it. "He's looking for work, apparently," her father said. "Cardwell said he asked about ranches hiring." Emmeline was quiet for a moment. They had lost 2 hands in September, one to a better offer from a ranch near Albuquerque, one to a broken arm that hadn't healed right and would never let him rope again. She had been managing with 3 men and herself for 6 weeks, and it was starting to show in the fence lines and the ledger both. "We need the hands," she said carefully. "We do," her father agreed. He looked at her sideways. "Cardwell said he seemed capable, quiet, kept to himself. We don't know anything about him." "No," her father said, "we don't." She looked at the sky a while longer. The purple was deepening into navy now, the first star appearing above the eastern ridge. She thought about the way Rafael Vega had looked at her across that dusty street, steady and still, like a man who had learned at great cost to keep everything he felt below the surface. She recognized that quality. She had cultivated it in herself for 2 years. "I'll go talk to him in the morning," she said. Her father made a sound that might have been approval and might have been just breathing. He was good at those sounds, her father. He had raised her mostly alone after her mother died, and he had learned early that Emmeline made better decisions when she felt like she was making them herself. She found Rafael Vega at first light, which surprised her. She had expected to find him at the saloon, where Peterman kept 2 rooms above the bar for travelers. Instead, he was behind the saloon, in the narrow alley between the building and the livery fence, sitting cross-legged on the ground with his back against the wall and a small fire going in a ring of stones, heating something in a tin cup. His horse was tied nearby. He had not, apparently, rented the room at all. He heard her before she saw him, or perhaps he heard her horse. He looked up without any appearance of surprise, which itself surprised her. "You're Miss Holt," he said. "You know who I am. Cardwell mentioned you, said you run the Holt Ranch since your father's injury." He paused. He mentioned it with respect. She dismounted, which she hadn't entirely planned to do, but it felt wrong to have this conversation from horseback. She stood at the entrance to the alley, keeping the space between them deliberate and professional. "I heard you're looking for work," she said. "I am. What kind of work can you do?" "Cattle work, fence repair, tracking strays, some carpentry." He paused. "I can also handle trouble if trouble comes." "What kind of trouble do you usually bring with you?" she asked. He looked at her for a moment without speaking, and she saw something flicker in his eyes, not offense, exactly, but something more complicated, like the question had found a bruise. "The kind that's already passed," he said. It was either a very good answer or a very rehearsed one. She wasn't sure which yet. "I pay fair wages," she said. "You'd bunk with the other hands in the east cabin. I run the ranch myself, and I expect that to be respected, not worked around. If you have a problem with a woman giving orders, you should say so now." He picked up his tin cup, drank from it slowly, and set it down. "I don't have a problem with it," he said. "Where are you from?" "Originally, a village near Durango. I've been working ranches in the territory for 7 years. References." He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper, which he held out to her. She crossed the alley and took it. It was a letter from a ranch owner named Caldwell near Taos, dated 8 months ago, saying that Rafael Vega had worked for him for 3 years and was the most reliable hand he'd employed in 2 decades, and that Caldwell was only sorrowful to lose him. The handwriting was emphatic. People didn't write like that about hands they didn't genuinely mean it about. She folded the letter and handed it back. "When can you start?" she said. "Now," he said. She almost smiled. She caught it and held it back. "Finish your coffee first," she said, and walked back to her horse. He was good. That was the infuriating and uncomplicated truth of it. Within 3 days of his arrival at the Holt Ranch, Emmeline had to admit to herself, quietly, never out loud, that Rafael Vega was one of the most capable ranch hands she had ever watched work. He was methodical without being slow. He asked exactly the right questions and no unnecessary ones. He read cattle the way some men read books, with attention and patience and something that looked almost like affection. He fixed the eastern fence line in 2 days that she had expected to take a week. The other hands, Denny, Cole, and Old Marsh, absorbed him without friction, which was itself notable. Ranch hands were territorial creatures by nature, and a new man who came incapable often drew quiet resentment. But Rafael moved through the camp like water finding its level, present, useful, undemanding. He ate with the others. He did his share of the fire and the dishes. He told one story, on the 3rd evening, about a cattle drive gone wrong in a rainstorm near the Rio Grande. And he told it well, funny in the right places, honest about the fear. And after that the men treated him like he had been there a month already. Emmeline watched all of this from her careful professional distance. She gave him instructions each morning. He carried them out. She checked his work in the evenings. It was always right. Sometimes it was better than right, a fence post reinforced in a way she hadn't specified, but that was clearly the stronger choice, a water trough repositioned 6 inches to account for the slope of the ground and the way the cattle actually stood when they drank. Small improvements, thoughtful ones. The kind that required actually looking at a problem rather than just solving the version of it you'd been given. She noticed all of it. She wished she didn't notice quite so much. On his 6th day, she rode out to check on the southern pasture and found him there already, his horse ground-tied nearby, walking the fence line with a practiced eye and a notebook open in his hand. He was making notes. She pulled up and watched him for a moment before he heard her, and in that unguarded moment, she saw something in how he moved, a quality of aloneness that she recognized not as loneliness, but as something more chosen. Like a man who had made a decision, somewhere along the way, to carry everything quietly. He turned and saw her and gave a small nod. South fence has 3 weak posts in the lower stretch, he said, holding up the notebook. I mapped them, thought you might want to know before the autumn storms come in. Thank you, she said. He looked at her steadily for a moment, that same quality she had noticed the first day, measuring something, and then looked back at his notebook. You ride out here every evening, he asked. Most evenings. Why this pasture? She hesitated. It was a personal question, not intrusive exactly, but personal. My mother is buried at the east edge of it, she said, near the old cottonwood. He was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry, he said, simply and without performance, which was the right way to say it. It was a long time ago, she said, but she had ridden out this evening for that reason, and something about having been seen in that private habit made the air between them feel slightly different, warmer and more exposed at the same time. I'll finish the notes and let you ride on, he said, and turned back to the fence. She sat on her horse for a moment longer than she needed to, watching him write in his notebook in the long light of evening, and then she rode on toward the cottonwood. Weeks passed. October became November. The air sharpened and the light changed color, going from amber to a paler, more silver gold in the afternoons. The cattle grew their winter coats and the work shifted, less riding the range, more maintenance, preparation, stocking the feed stores against the hard months ahead. Rafael Vega settled into the life of the Holt Ranch the way a stone settles into riverbed. He was simply there, and then it became hard to remember time when he hadn't been. It emerged gradually, a dry and understated sense of humor that surfaced in careful doses, never showing off, never performing, just occasionally saying the exact right quiet thing at the exact right moment. He also had opinions about books, which surprised everyone. Old Marsh found a dime novel in the bunkhouse one evening, and the resulting conversation, which started as gentle mockery and became a real and surprisingly sharp discussion about the difference between how the West was lived and how it was written, lasted until well past dark. And at the end of it, Emmeline thought she had not talked that freely about ideas since she was in school. She had been in the bunkhouse doorway, ostensibly to bring the weekly wage envelope for the men. She had stayed for the conversation. She had not entirely meant to. She noticed, during that conversation, the way Raphael listened. He had a quality of attention that was rare and a little disorienting. He looked at whoever was speaking as if their words mattered, as if he were filing them away with care. When he looked at her, she felt it more acutely than she wanted to, like being read by someone who was very good at reading and very quiet about what they found. She rode home in the cold dark and told herself she was being foolish. She was not quite being foolish. The trouble started on a Friday in mid-November, which was when Garfield Cross rode onto Holt land for the first time in 6 months. Garfield Cross owned the largest ranch in the basin, 2,000 acres of good grass between the North Ridge and the creek, and he had wanted to own the Holt land for 7 years. He had offered to buy it from Emmeline's father twice, politely. He had offered once to marry Emmeline, which she had declined with a courtesy that had cost her considerably. He had been less polite since. He rode up to the Holt house with 2 of his men on a clear, cold afternoon, and Emmeline met him on the porch, arms crossed, expression neutral. He was a large man, well-dressed by Redrock crossing standards, with a wide, flat face and small, careful eyes and the permanent expression of someone doing arithmetic. "Emmeline," he said, touching his hat brim. "Mr. Cross," she said. He looked at the ranch with the measuring gaze of a man pricing something. "Heard you've been struggling with the southern fence. Thought maybe we could discuss the lease arrangement again, use of my water access in exchange for—" "The fence is repaired," she said, "and we're not discussing the lease." His eyes moved past her to the yard, where Raphael had appeared from the direction of the barn. He was carrying a saddle over one shoulder, and he had stopped when he saw the visitors, standing still and reading the situation with that careful attentiveness of his. Cross looked at Raphael for a long moment. "New hand," he said, not a question. "That's right," Emmeline said. "Where's he from?" "He works for me," she said. "That's what matters." Cross looked back at her with those small calculating eyes. "You're making things harder on yourself than they need to be, Emmeline. Your father's not well. The ranch is a lot for one woman to manage. There are arrangements that could—" "Good afternoon, Mr. Cross," she said. He sat on his horse for another moment, looking at her, and then he looked at Raphael again in a way that was not entirely about the saddle. Then he touched his hat brim and turned his horse and rode out with his men behind him. Emmeline stayed on the porch until they were through the gate. Then she breathed out slowly. "Trouble," Raphael said from the yard. "A kind of trouble," she said. "The kind that wears a nice hat and thinks patience is a strategy." He set the saddle down on the fence rail. He had that look again, the reading look. "Does he come out often?" "More lately," she said, "since my father's fall." Raphael was quiet for a moment. "He wants the land. He wants everything in this basin that isn't already his," she said. "He just packages it differently depending on who he's talking to." She went inside before she said anything else, because she was aware of being angrier than she wanted to show, and being aware that she was showing too much of it to someone she had known for less than a month, which felt like a much longer time than it was. That evening she sat at the kitchen table with the account books open and could not make the numbers do what she needed them to do. The winter hay purchase had been higher than expected. 2 of the cattle had died in a fence accident in September before Raphael arrived. The repair materials had cost more than budgeted. The margin was thin. It was always thin. She had been managing thin margins for a year and a half, and she was tired of it in the specific way that is not about rest, but about the grinding weight of sustained responsibility. Her father knocked on the kitchen doorframe. He always knocked now, since the fall, as if he were a guest in his own house, which broke her heart a little every time. "Numbers bad," he said. "Numbers are numbers," she said. He came and sat across from her, moving carefully with his cane, and he looked at the ledger without pretending he wasn't looking at it. He was quiet for a while. Outside the window the night was very dark and very still, the way nights in the basin could be in November. "The Vega boy is good," he said. "He is," she agreed. "You've been riding out evenings again," he said. "Later than usual." She kept her eyes on the ledger. The southern pasture needed checking. "The southern pasture," her father said, with a quality of voice that held exactly as much meaning as she was afraid it held, "needed checking." "Papa." "I'm not saying anything," he said. "You're saying something," she said. He was quiet again. Then, "Your mother and I," he said slowly, "spent the first year of our marriage not saying what we meant to each other. We thought we were being careful. We thought we were being dignified." He paused. "It cost us a year. We got 40 more after that, so the accounting came out in our favor, but I still think about that year." Emmeline closed the ledger. She pressed her hands flat on the cover of it. "I don't know what you think you're seeing," she said. "No," said her father kindly, "you don't." He got up, kissed the top of her head the way he had done when she was 8 years old, and went to bed. She sat alone in the kitchen for a long time, listening to the wind come up over the ridge, and tried very hard not to think about what her father was and wasn't saying. The storm came in the second week of November, which was earlier than usual and harder than expected. It came from the northwest in the night, the temperature dropping 30 degrees in 6 hours, the wind carrying ice. By morning there were 4 inches of hard snow on the ground, and it was still falling, and the temperature was below freezing, and 2 things were immediately clear. The cattle in the high north pasture needed to be brought down, and the east water line had frozen and would need to be thawed and insulated before the horses suffered. Emmeline was out of bed before full light. She found Raphael already in the barn when she got there, saddling his horse in the lantern light, which meant he had assessed the situation and started moving before she gave any instruction. Denny and Cole came in a few minutes later, sleep-fogged and grumbling. Old Marsh came last, moving stiffly in the cold. "North pasture first," Emmeline said. "Raphael, you and I will take the high run. Denny, Cole, you come up from the draw and push south. Marsh, stay with the horses and start on the water line." Nobody argued, nobody questioned the division of labor. They moved. High Run was steep, and the snow made it treacherous, and the wind off the mesa was a physical thing, a weight pushing against you. Emmeline rode hard and tried to keep the chill from getting into her bones. Raphael rode beside her or slightly ahead of her on the narrow parts, and he had a way of reading the terrain in the poor visibility that she found herself trusting instinctively. When he slowed, she slowed. When he angled left on a slope, she followed, and each time it turned out to be the right choice. They found the cattle bunched at the north fence, 63 head, bewildered and miserable in the storm. Getting them moving was work. Cattle in cold weather are stubborn in their misery, reluctant to move even toward warmth, and it took an hour of riding and shouting, and the kind of patient insistence that livestock require before they finally began to flow south toward the lower pasture and the windbreak of the barn. Halfway down the slope, in a narrow cut between 2 rock faces, Emmeline's horse slipped. It was a sudden thing, 1 second solid ground and the next her horse's hindquarters going out sideways on a patch of ice beneath the snow. She felt the drop and grabbed for the saddle horn on pure reflex, and then everything lurched back upright because Raphael had put his horse bodily against hers, pressing in from the left, a solid wall of animal and momentum that stopped the slide. For a moment they were very close. His arm had come out, not quite touching her, but close, fingers extended, the instinctive human reach toward a person who might fall. The horses were pressed flank to flank. His face was 6 inches from hers, both of them breathing hard and white-breathed in the cold. He pulled back carefully. "You all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. Her voice was steadier than she felt. "Ice shelf under the snow in this cut. Go right of the rock face." "Right," she said, and meant 2 things by it. They brought the cattle down. They got them into the lower pasture and the windbreak held. The water line took another 2 hours with fire and insulation and frozen fingers, but it came right eventually. By midday, they were all inside the barn, exhausted and cold and alive, and old Marsh produced a flask of something that he passed around without comment. Raphael sat on a hay bale across from Emmeline, steam rising from his coat as he warmed. He was quiet, which was normal. He was looking at his hands, flexing the cold stiffened fingers, which was normal too. But then he looked up and found her looking at him, and neither of them looked away for longer than they should have, which was something else. It was Denny who broke it by dropping the flask and cursing, and then Cole laughed, and the moment dispersed like breath in cold air. But Emmeline kept the warmth of it, privately, without acknowledging what she was keeping. Part 2, What Grows in Winter. The storm lasted 3 days. On the 4th day it cleared and left the basin clean and white and extraordinarily beautiful in the cold light. Emmeline walked the property line in the morning and found everything intact. Some fence posts needed resetting where the ice had worked at the posts, but the cattle were healthy, the horses were fine, and the bunkhouse chimney was still standing. She found Raphael outside the bunkhouse, sitting on an upturned crate in a rare patch of thin winter sunlight, doing something she wouldn't have expected, sketching. He had a small battered notebook open across his knee, the same one he used for fence notes and cattle counts, and he was drawing with a short stub of pencil, his head bent with that complete and quiet concentration she was beginning to recognize as characteristic of him. She stopped. She should have kept walking. She kept walking forward toward him, as if that had been her direction all along. He heard her and tilted the notebook slightly closed, not hiding it exactly, but making it private, and she thought something small and sad about the instinct to protect a private thing from observation, the way you only did that with things that genuinely mattered to you. "Don't stop on my account," she said. "Just passing time," he said. "What were you drawing?" He was quiet a moment, then he opened the notebook again and held it out to her. She took it and looked. He had drawn the mesa, the North Mesa specifically, as it looked in winter from the south yard of the ranch, the long flat summit, the vertical red face of it, the snow lying on the top in a particular way that made it look like something draped over the stone. It was good. It was genuinely, surprisingly good, not the drawing of a man who sketched as a hobby to pass winter afternoons, but of someone who had real eyes for proportion and shadow and the specific character of a place. "You can draw," she said. She was aware this was not a brilliant observation. "My mother drew," he said. "She taught me some." She looked at the sketch a moment longer. He had caught something true about the mesa, not just its shape, but its quality of presence, the way it dominated the basin without being aggressive about it. She handed the notebook back. "Where is your mother now?" she asked. "She died when I was 22, he said. He said it simply, without the careful deflection people often used around grief. Just the fact of it, held plainly. "I'm sorry," she said, the same way he had said it to her about her mother, simply and without performance. "She would have liked this place," he said, looking at the mesa. "She liked landscapes that had character, that you could tell had been through things." Emmeline looked at the mesa. She had been looking at it her whole life and never quite thought of it that way. She thought of it that way now. "I've been looking at that mesa since I was 4 years old," she said. "I've never had anyone describe it to me before." He glanced at her, a quick sideways look that he didn't quite sustain. "People don't always say what they're seeing," he said. And then, quietly, "I think that's a mistake." The sentence landed in her somewhere unexpectedly deep. She stood in the thin winter sunlight and felt it sitting there, pressing gently against something she kept well defended. "Probably is," she said after a moment, and walked on. The town of Redrock Crossing had a habit of knowing things before it should, and so it was not long before the town had opinions about the new Holt hand. Most of the opinions were mundane. He was capable, he was quiet, he kept to himself, he seemed decent enough. A few of the opinions, delivered in the particular careful way that passed for subtlety in small towns, were less mundane. Mrs. Peterman at the saloon mentioned to her cousin that the new hand spent his free evenings talking with Miss Holt on the ranch porch when the weather allowed. Deputy Haas mentioned to Cardwell that he'd seen them riding the south fence line together in the late afternoon, which wasn't strictly necessary for fence inspection. Cardwell said nothing, but filed it away. Garfield Cross heard about all of it, because Garfield Cross made it his business to hear everything in the basin. On a cold Saturday in late November, he rode into town and had a drink at the saloon and said nothing particular to anyone, but he watched and he listened, and when he rode home, he was doing arithmetic again behind his small, careful eyes. Emmeline knew none of this specifically. She knew, in general, that she was observed, because she was always observed in Redrock Crossing, the daughter running her father's ranch, the woman who didn't remarry after Thomas left, the practical, capable, mysterious Miss Holt who didn't explain herself or apologize for anything. She was used to being watched. She had built a careful distance around herself that functioned like the fence line she rode every evening, necessary, maintained, visible enough to communicate that it was there. What she had not accounted for was someone who was also good at distance, who could stand on his side of it and somehow make the distance itself feel like a form of intimacy. Because that was what was happening with Rafael Vega, slowly and without either of them naming it. Not a crossing of the line, but a recognition that the line existed, and that they were both aware of it, and that this shared awareness had a warmth to it that had nothing to do with how close they stood to each other, and everything to do with how well they were beginning to see each other. She knew by mid-November the way he took his coffee. She knew the specific quality of silence that meant he was thinking through a problem versus the quality that meant he was simply at rest. She knew that he slept less than the other men, that he was often the first one moving in the mornings, and that this was not ambition, but something older and more restless in him, some engine that didn't fully stop. She knew he had a book he read by firelight, a collection of essays by someone she hadn't heard of, and that he read slowly, the way people read when they don't want to finish something. She knew these things the way you know them when you've been paying attention without meaning to, without deciding to, until one day you take inventory and find you have been paying very close attention for quite some time. She did not ask herself why. She was afraid of the answer. The day she asked herself why was a Thursday in early December, and it was because of Denny. Denny was the youngest of the three original hands, 20 years old, good-natured and not particularly perceptive, and he said things that more careful people kept to themselves. He said the thing in question at the supper table in the bunkhouse, when Emmeline had come by with a message about the following day's work, and she happened to be standing in the doorway when he said it. What he said was, to Raphael, in a tone of genuine friendly curiosity, "You ever gonna court Miss Holt, or are you just gonna keep looking at her like that forever?" There was a silence like a stone dropped into deep water. Old Marsh studied his plate with great intensity. Cole coughed. Raphael turned to look at Denny with an expression that Emmeline could not entirely see from the doorway. She could see the back of his head and Denny's face, which had gone from cheerful to alarmed, and said something too quiet for her to hear. She did not wait to hear anything else. She stepped back from the doorway and walked quickly back to the house, her face warm in the cold night air, her heartbeat doing something she did not approve of. She sat in the kitchen with the lamp turned low and made herself be honest. Not brave, she wasn't ready for brave. Just honest, alone in her kitchen, with no one to be careful for. She thought about Raphael riding beside her in the storm, his arm extended toward her on instinct. She thought about the Mesa drawing and what he had said about people not saying what they were seeing. She thought about every evening on the fence line, every sideways glance held a moment too long, every conversation that lasted past the point of necessity and into something that felt quietly like being known. She thought about how she had felt the day Thomas Garrett left, which was not the grief she had expected, but a complicated relief she had spent 2 years not examining. She thought about how, for a long time since, no one had made her want to be seen. She sat with all of that for a long time. Then she got up, banked the fire, and went to bed, and lay in the dark with her eyes open, listening to the wind, and made no decisions about any of it, and slept badly. The following morning she was professional and competent and entirely in command of herself. She gave the day's orders clearly, she rode the north pasture, she fixed a gate latch, she was fine. She was also aware, with a clarity that was new and slightly uncomfortable, that Raphael was fine too, that he had the same quality of careful professional normality that she was performing, and that this mirroring meant they were both, in their separate careful ways, holding the same thing. She did not address it, he did not address it, the day passed. What finally cracked the silence open was not a dramatic moment, it was a book. 3 days after the bunkhouse evening, on a cold Sunday afternoon when there was no pressing work, Emmeline was in the main house sitting room trying to read. She was not reading. She was thinking about the ledger and also about not thinking about other things. Her father was asleep in his room. The house was very quiet. She heard boots on the porch steps, a knock at the door. She opened it. Raphael stood on the porch. He was not in work clothes. He had on a clean shirt and a dark vest, and he was holding a book with its cover facing down in a way that looked like he'd changed his mind about something twice on the walk over. "I thought," he stopped, started again. "The essay collection I've been reading, you mentioned once that you read when you could. I thought you might." He held out the book. She looked at it, she looked at him. Something in her chest contracted and then expanded, the way the cold air did when it came in the front door and met the warmth of the fire inside. "Come in," she said. He hesitated, one beat of genuine uncertainty, which she found more affecting than confidence would have been. Then he stepped inside. They sat in the sitting room for 3 hours, not talking constantly. There were long, easy silences in which she read and he looked at the fire, but talking when they talked, really talking about the book and what it said, and what they thought about what it said, and gradually, sideways, about other things. About Durango and what it had been like growing up there, about what brought him to the territory, about what her mother had been like, and what the ranch had looked like before the drought years of the late 70s changed the grass. About what they each wanted for the future, that most careful of questions, the one that reveals the most when answered honestly. He wanted a place, he said, not grand, a working place with good land that he could be responsible for, that he could know the way you knew a thing you had given real attention to over years. He wanted to be somewhere long enough to learn all of it. She felt the honesty of it, like a hand extended across the space between them. She told him more carefully that she wanted to keep the Holt land, that she wanted her father to die knowing it would be tended, that she wanted, and here she paused and said it quietly, looking at the fire, to be understood by someone, not managed, not handled, understood. The room was very quiet when she said that. He was looking at her when she looked up, that steady, careful, reading look that she had been responding to for weeks without naming what she was responding to. And she saw in it something that had no performance in it at all, something genuine and a little undefended and serious in the way that mattered. "You're understood," he said, quietly, like a fact. She looked at him for a long moment. The fire crackled. Outside the window, the last of the winter light was going from the mesa. She was the one who looked away first this time, and she did it not because she wanted to, but because the alternative was something she wasn't ready for in her father's sitting room on a Sunday afternoon. And she was still, beneath everything, a woman who moved carefully. "It's getting late," she said. "It is," he said. He picked up his book, which she had forgotten she was holding. And she handed it back, and their fingers were in the same space for a moment, not quite touching, not quite not. And then he was standing and thanking her for the afternoon, and she was standing too and walking him to the door. He paused on the porch in the cold dark. He turned back once. "Thank you," he said again, and it meant more things than 2 words usually did. "Good night, Raphael," she said. She said his name. She had not said his name before. Not like that, not just as identification, but as something held for a moment in the mouth before releasing. They both heard it. "Good night, Emmeline," he said, and walked back across the dark yard to the bunkhouse, and she closed the door and stood with her back against it, and her eyes shut, and her heart doing things she had no intention of stopping. Part 3, The Complication. Garfield Cross moved in December, which was typical of him, waiting until people were occupied with winter, and then moving when the ground was difficult and everyone had less energy to resist. He went to Emmeline's father directly, which was the choice of a man who believed that a woman's decisions could be circumvented by finding the man behind them. What he did not know, what most people in Red Rock Crossing had not fully processed, was that James Holt had not made a significant decision about the ranch in 18 months by choice. He had made Emmeline the decision-maker, legally and practically, and he stood by those decisions the way he stood by very few things. Cross came to the house on a Wednesday when Emmeline was out riding, sat with James Holt over coffee, and made an offer for the eastern parcel, the one with the water access, the richest piece of Holt land, at a price that was technically fair but strategically devastating, because losing the eastern parcel would compromise the whole ranch's water access and force a slow decline. James Holt listened. He thanked Cross for his visit. He said nothing else. When Emmeline came home that evening, her father told her about the visit with the directness of a man who has learned the cost of not saying things plainly. She sat down at the kitchen table and felt, simultaneously, a cold, practical anger and something more personal underneath it, the particular humiliation of being managed around, even unsuccessfully. "He went to you because he thinks I'll say no but you'll say yes," she said. "I know that," her father said. "Did he think you wouldn't tell me?" I think he thought that even if you said no afterward, the seed would be in my mind, that I'd think about it, that financial worry would do his work for him over time. Her father's voice was measured. He's not stupid, Garfield Cross. No, she said, he's not. She thought about the ledger. She thought about the thin margins and the cold winter and the 2 dead cattle in September. She thought about what it would mean if the margins got thinner, and what options a woman alone with a damaged father and a struggling ranch had in 1882 in a basin where one man controlled most of the water. She sat there for a long time. Then she went to her room and stood at the window looking at the dark barn and the dim light in the bunkhouse window and the stars above the mesa. And she made herself be very honest about the situation in its entirety, which was frightening and clarifying in equal measure. The ranch would survive the winter. She believed that. Spring would be difficult but workable. What she needed was for nothing else to go wrong, and for the margins to hold, and for Garfield Cross to find another project for his patience and his arithmetic. What she did not need was the additional complication of her feelings for a ranch hand she had known for 2 months, which would make things harder in ways she couldn't entirely predict, and which she therefore had a sensible and perfectly reasonable argument for not pursuing. She stood at the window and made that argument to herself, carefully and completely. Then she went to bed and acknowledged in the dark that the argument had not worked. Raphael came to her the next morning before the others were up. Not for any improper reason, he had no way of knowing that she had spent a portion of the previous night thinking about him. He came because he had ridden the south pasture at first light and found 3 fence posts down, and he wanted her to know before she gave the day's orders so she could account for the repair time. She was standing on the porch with her coffee when he came across the yard. He could see she knew that something was off with her. She was less composed than usual, standing in the cold with her coffee going, looking at the mesa. He came up the porch steps and stopped and looked at the mesa too, with the courtesy of a man who understood that sometimes you needed someone to stand beside you quietly without asking questions. "The fence," he said after a moment. "Tell me," she said. He told her efficiently and clearly. She filed it away. Then they stood there a moment more in the cold morning quiet. "Cross came to see my father yesterday," she said. She hadn't planned to say it. He was very still, the eastern parcel. "Yes," she glanced at him. "How did you know?" "It's the strategic piece. If I wanted to pressure this ranch, that's what I'd go for." He said it without self-consciousness, just the clear reading of a tactical situation. Then, carefully, "He went to your father rather than you." "He thought it would be easier," she said. Her voice was flat. Raphael turned and looked at her directly. "You're angry," he said, not a question, not discomfort about the anger, just a namming of it, without judgment. "I am," she said. "I'm very angry." "Good," he said. She looked at him. "Good. It means you're not afraid," he said. "You're angry instead of afraid. That's the right order." She stood with that for a moment. She was, in fact, also afraid of the margins, afraid of Cross, afraid of what it meant to be a woman alone holding a piece of land against a man who had more money and more patience. But Raphael was right that the anger was sitting on top of the fear, and that the anger was what she'd need to make something useful from. "Thank you," she said, "for the fence information. For this," she didn't specify. He nodded and went back across the yard, and she stood watching him go with a feeling she was done pretending she didn't have. What happened between them did not happen the way things happened in novels, which Emmeline appreciated. There was no single dramatic declaration, no rain-soaked confrontation, no moment where one of them said everything in one breathless sentence and the other one answered with their whole heart. What happened was smaller and more true than that. It was a series of small crossings of a distance that had been narrowing for weeks, each one modest enough to be deniable in isolation and accumulative in the way that mattered. It was the afternoon. She brought 2 cups of coffee to the barn where he was working and stayed to drink hers, leaning against the stall opposite him, talking about nothing important for 45 minutes. It was the evening he came to find her when she had not come back from the southern pasture at the usual hour, riding up quietly in the last of the light to find her sitting by her mother's cottonwood and sitting down nearby without asking or explaining, just being present. It was the day she showed him the ledger. She had never shown anyone the ledger except her father and the bank. She spread it open on the kitchen table and showed him the real state of the ranch's finances, the thin margins, the difficult winter, the careful calculation that stood between them and failure, and he looked at it for a long time and then looked at her and said, "What do you need? Not what does the ranch need? What do you need?" "I need it to hold," she said. "It'll hold," he said, and she believed him, which was not naive because it was not a promise about the numbers, it was a promise about something else, about not being alone in the holding of it. It was all of these things accumulating. And it was the evening in the third week of December when she was walking back from the barn in the dark, her breath clouding in the cold, and he fell into step beside her on the path, not reaching for her, not performing anything, and she reached over and took his hand. Just that, just her hand finding his in the dark, both of them stopping, both of them standing still on the frozen path between the barn and the house, with the stars enormous overhead and the cold pressing in from all sides. His hand was warm. He held hers carefully, like something that might startle. "Emmeline," he said, just her name, the way she had said his name that evening on the porch, held for a moment, carrying more than its syllables. "I know," she said. "I don't want to make your life harder," he said. "I know how much you're managing already. I know what it costs in a town like this when—" "Raphael," she said quietly. He stopped. "I know all of that," she said. "I've thought about all of that." She paused. "I'm still standing here." The night was very quiet. Somewhere on the ridge, a coyote called, distant and thin. He brought her hand up and pressed it briefly, gently, against his chest, over his heartbeat, which was not as steady as his face usually was, and she felt that, the quick, honest rhythm of it, and it was more than any declaration. They stood there in the cold for a long time, just that, just close, just warm where they touched, just honest. Then she squeezed his hand, and they walked the rest of the way to the porch, and at the steps they stopped, and she looked up at him in the starlight, and what passed between them in that look was something that did not need to be spoken, not yet, perhaps not ever, because some things are large enough that language diminishes them. "Good night," she said. "Good night," he said. She went inside. She stood at the window and watched him cross the dark yard, and he stopped once, halfway across, and looked back at the window. She did not step back from it. He smiled. She could see it even in the starlight. Then he kept walking. She stood there for a long time after the bunkhouse door closed. Part 4. What GTS tested. Christmas came and went quietly in Red Rock Crossing, the way things went quietly in places where people had a lot of work and not a lot of performance. Emmeline's father was well enough on Christmas Day to sit at the table for dinner, and there were 4 plates, her father, herself, and she had asked Denny and Cole, whose families were distant and who would otherwise have had the bunkhouse on Christmas. Old Marsh had ridden north to his sister's family for the week. She had not asked Raphael separately. She had asked all the hands, and he had heard, and he had come. He sat at the far end of the table from her father and across from Denny, and her father watched him with the careful measuring eye of a man who had raised a daughter and knew what he was looking at. The conversation ranged freely: the ranch, the winter, a train line they'd heard might eventually reach the territory, what the spring looked like. Her father told a long story about a cattle drive from his youth that got several things terrifyingly wrong and ended in an unlikely triumph. And he told it well, and Raphael listened with his real attention, the kind that made whoever was talking feel like they were saying something worth hearing. At the end of the meal, her father looked across the table at Raphael and said, "You play cards, Mr. Vega." "Some," Raphael said. "Then Denny's going to deal," her father said, and produced a worn deck from his vest pocket, and Emmeline watched her father, who had not been this animated in months, settle in for a long evening, and felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for a long time. She looked down the table at Raphael, and found him already looking at her, briefly, with something warm and private in it, before he turned back to the cards. Later, when Denny and Cole had walked back to the bunkhouse and her father had gone to bed, she and Raphael washed the dinner things in the kitchen together without discussing it, naturally, side by side at the basin, the lamp burning low, and the quiet between them was the easiest quiet she had experienced in years. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Thank you for asking," he said. "My father likes you," she said. "I like him," Raphael said simply. "He's a man who says what he means." "He is," she said. "He always has been." She handed him the last dish to dry, and their hands were in the same space for a moment, the same warmth, the same deliberate, gentle proximity as the night on the path, and neither of them hurried away from it. "How is he really?" Raphael said. "Not the version you tell the town." She was quiet for a moment. This was the question she didn't let people ask, but she had decided, in the dark after the night on the path, that she was done performing being fine for people who genuinely wanted to know. "Some days are good," she said. "Today was a good day, Maury days are not. He won't ride again, the leg healed wrong and the pain comes back when he's on horseback. He knows what that means for a man like him. She paused, adjusting to it. He's doing it with dignity, but it's slow and it's hard." Raphael was quiet for a moment. Then, "He's proud of you." She felt that, in her throat. "He hasn't said so." "He doesn't have to," Raphael said. "It's in everything about how he talks about the ranch. He says you and the ranch interchangeably sometimes, as if they're the same thing, as if what you've built and what you are can't be separated." She stood at the basin, with the dishwater going cold, and said nothing for a moment, because there was a tightness in her throat that she was managing. "You see a lot," she said finally. "I pay attention," he said, "to things that matter." The lamp made his shadow long on the kitchen wall. Outside the window it had begun to snow again, soft and slow, the kind of snow that didn't threaten but just covered the world in quiet. "To things that matter," she echoed, not quite asking. He looked at her steadily. "Yes," he said. She held his gaze and let him hold hers, and the kitchen was warm and the snow was falling outside and her father was asleep down the hall, and none of the things that complicated this, the ranch, Cross, the town, the fragility of everything she was maintaining, went away. But they receded, for that moment, to the appropriate distance of things that existed in a different room. "Merry Christmas, Raphael," she said. "Merry Christmas, Emmeline," he said. She walked him to the door. He put on his coat and his hat and paused on the threshold, the cold coming in around him, and he looked at her the way you look at something that is simultaneously where you are and where you want to be, and that look was a kind of promise that neither of them had to say out loud. Then he stepped off the porch into the snow, and she closed the door and pressed her back against it, and smiled in the empty kitchen like she was 18 years old. Garfield Cross moved again in January, and this time it wasn't quiet. He had found out because he found out everything about Raphael Vega's past. Not anything criminal, nothing dramatic. What he had found was that Raphael had left his previous position in Taos not over the work, but over disagreement with the ranch owner's son, who had made his intentions toward Raphael plain, and when rebuffed, had made things professionally difficult until Raphael chose to go rather than fight a battle with a man whose family owned the county. The ranch owner himself had known nothing about it and had written the reference letter in genuine regret. What Cross had found, in short, was the private matter of who Raphael was, the part of himself Raphael kept quiet in a world that would use it against him. Cross came to the ranch on a gray January afternoon, and this time he came alone, which was worse. He asked to speak with Emmeline. She met him in the yard. "I've learned some things about your new hand," he said without preamble. "Things you might want to know, things the town might want to know." She looked at him for a long moment. Her face was very still. "What things?" she said. Her voice was level. She already knew from the look on his face the category of thing he meant. "The kind of things," Cross said pleasantly, "that matter to people in a community like this one." The kind of things that can make it difficult for a man to find work if they become widely known. The air between them was very cold. "You're threatening to ruin a man's livelihood," she said. "I'm offering you information," he said. "What you do with it is your choice." "What do you want?" she said. "The eastern parcel," he said, "at the price I offered your father." She looked at him for a long moment. The wind came down off the mesa and moved her coat, and somewhere behind her she heard the barn door and knew, without looking, that it was Raphael, that he had heard the horses, that he had come out to see who had ridden up, that he was standing somewhere behind her reading the situation. She thought about what it would mean to sell the eastern parcel. She thought about what it would mean for the ranch. She thought about what it would mean to buy one man's silence with another person's land and livelihood. She thought about what it would mean to do it the other way. "No," she said. Cross blinked. He had not expected that answer this quickly. "Miss Holt." "I said no," she said, "to the parcel and to whatever you think you have on my employee. You will not threaten men who work for me. You will not threaten this ranch. And if you repeat whatever you think you know about Mr. Vega in this town, I will stand up in the middle of Sunday service and tell every person in Red Rock Crossing exactly what Garfield Cross did today, which is attempt extortion. I will be specific, I will be loud, and I will be believed, because I have lived in this basin my entire life, and you know that my word carries weight." Cross stared at her. "You should go home," she said. He went. He did not go quickly. Men like Cross never went quickly, because going quickly conceded too much. But he went, and she stood in the cold yard and watched him ride out the gate, and did not move until he was through it, and the dust of his horse was gone. Then she turned around. Raphael was standing 10 feet behind her. He had heard. He was very still, and his face was doing something complicated, not the careful stillness of his usual composure, but something genuinely shaken, like a man who had been prepared to defend himself and found instead that someone had stepped in front of him. She looked at him, he looked at her. "You didn't have to do that," he said. His voice was careful and quiet. "I know," she said. "The parcel is mine to keep or sell for my own reasons," she said, "not because a man who runs a cattle operation like a chess game decides it suits him." He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved between them. "You knew," he said. "It was not quite a question." "I guessed," she said. "It didn't change anything." He looked at her with that steady reading gaze, and this time she saw something in it she hadn't seen before, something raw and grateful and a little devastated. The look of a man who has been carefully managing a vulnerability for a long time and has just had someone treat it like it was nothing to be ashamed of. "Emmeline," he said. "It doesn't change anything," she said again, firmly and gently both. "I need you to know that. It doesn't change a single thing." He stood there in the cold, and she watched something in him, some long-held tension, some careful constructed defense, quietly come down. "All right," he said finally, softly. "All right," she agreed. They stood in the cold yard for a moment more. Then he said quietly, "Thank you." And she said, "Don't thank me, just finish the south fence before the next storm." And because he was Raphael Vega, he almost smiled, and the almost smile was better than most people's whole ones. Part 5. What holds? February arrived with a week of hard cold, and then broke into an unexpected warmth. One of those New Mexico Territory fall springs that came like a rumor of what was coming, and then retreated before making anything official. For 3 days, the temperature climbed into the 40s, and the snow began to pull back from the high ground, and the whole basin smelled like wet earth and the possibility of grass. Emmeline took advantage of the break to ride the whole property line, all of it, the full perimeter, which took most of a day. She did this twice a year usually, in fall and spring, a ritual assessment of the land and what it needed. She did it alone, normally. This year she found, when she saddled up in the early morning, that Raphael had saddled his horse too. She looked at him. "You want to ride the perimeter," he said, "not a question." "I always ride it alone," she said. I know, he said. He didn't offer any argument. He just stood there, holding both horses, giving the decision back to her without pressure. She thought about it for a moment. She thought about 2 years of riding the fence line alone, every late afternoon, checking the same posts, watching the same sky. She thought about what it meant to let someone ride it with her. We'll start at the northwest corner, she said. They rode all day. They stopped for the noon hour at the old line shack in the north pasture, where someone had left a tin of hardtack in the cupboard 3 years ago, and it was still technically edible. And they ate hardtack and drank water from the creek and sat on the fallen log outside the shack in the thin, warm February sun and talked. They talked for an hour, easily and completely, about everything and nothing. The ranch, the territory, the books they'd read, what the land looked like in different seasons, what Durango had been like in spring, and what Red Rock Crossing was like in summer when the heat sat in the basin and everything shimmered and the creek ran lower, and the whole world seemed to slow down to a kind of amber stillness. At one point, there was a long silence that was not empty but full, the kind of silence that happens between people who have nothing to prove to each other and therefore nothing to fill. I've been alone a long time, Raphael said, eventually, not with self-pity, just as a statement of fact offered plainly. So have I, she said. Not the same thing, he said. You've been surrounded by people, the ranch, the town, you've been alone inside all of that. She looked at him. He was right, and she hadn't thought of it in quite those words, and the rightness of it hit her with unexpected force. Yes, she said, that. He looked at the mesa, then back at her. I want to stop being alone, he said. I think I have been for a long time. I chose it because it was easier, because caring about things and people and places means there are things to lose. He paused, but I think I've been using caution as an excuse for a long time. She sat with that. The sun was going west, and the shadow of the mesa was starting to reach across the basin. I think I have too, she said. After Thomas left, I decided a lot of things. Some of them were protection, some of them were just, she paused, habit, the habit of not needing. You can need things, he said, quietly, directly. I'm learning that, she said. He was looking at her with complete and honest attention, and she was looking back at him, and the afternoon was warm, and the sky was that particular pale blue that New Mexico does in February between cold spells, and the distance between them on that log was very small. She leaned forward and kissed him. It was brief and certain, and everything that had been building for 4 months, and he was very still for one suspended moment, and then not still at all, his hand coming up to her face, careful and warm, the way he did everything, and the afternoon held them. When she pulled back, she was looking at him from very close, and his eyes were open and looking back at her, and everything he was feeling was right there on his face without the careful management, and she thought, there you are, there you actually are. Emmeline, he said, her name again in that particular way. I know, she said, which was not an answer and was all the answer. They sat there in the February warmth for a long time, close and warm and no longer careful, and the mesa went from red to gold to shadow in the west, and when it was time to ride home, they rode home together in the fading light, side by side on the wide trail, and neither of them needed to say a word. Part 6, Spring. March brought real spring, which in New Mexico meant wind and new green on the hills, and the creek running high and fast with snowmelt, and the particular busyness that came with the start of the cattle season after a long winter. The work was full and hard and good. The margins that had been thin all winter began, slowly, to improve with the spring prices. Emmeline hired a fourth hand, a taciturn older man named Wilkes who had good references and kept to himself, which meant the ranch was better staffed than it had been since before her father's fall. Garfield Cross did not come back. He was not, she thought, finished. Men like Cross were never finished, but he had recalculated and was waiting for a different moment. And in the meantime, the Holt ranch ran and the fence held, and the cattle came through the winter better than expected. Her father noticed things. He said nothing specific. He watched Raphael at dinner, at work, coming across the yard. He watched Emmeline's face when she didn't know he was watching. And one morning in early March, he called her into the sitting room and she sat across from him and he looked at her for a long moment. "Are you happy?" he said. She considered the question. She thought about the last weeks, the work, the evenings, the mornings, the small accumulated daily intimacy of two people who have decided to stop being alone. She thought about what happy meant as opposed to careful, as opposed to managing, as opposed to fine. "Yes," she said, simply. Her father nodded. He was quiet for a moment. "He's a good man," he said. "I know," she said. "He's going to need time," her father said. "Men who have been managed by the world the way he has, they need time to believe things are solid, that they won't be taken away." He paused. "Be patient with that." She looked at her father, this man who had raised her to be capable and direct and careful, who had in his own grief and his own limitation found ways to still give her what she needed. "I will be," she said. He nodded again. Then, "Are you staying in for supper?" "I'm staying in for supper," she said. And that was all that needed to be said. In April the basin turned green, and the work was its own reward. The way spring work always was after a winter's worth of maintenance and waiting. Emmeline rode the south pasture in the evenings, and Raphael rode with her when the work allowed, which was most evenings. The cottonwood by her mother's grave was greening, small new leaves unfurling in the warm afternoons. They stopped there sometimes, the way she had always stopped alone, and he would stand beside her and look at the grave marker and the tree and say nothing unless she wanted to speak. And when she spoke, he listened with his whole attention. She told him about her mother, things she hadn't told anyone, details and memories that she had been keeping private for 15 years. He told her about his own mother in return, about Durango and the mountains there, and what it had been like to leave the only place he'd known. They were not formal about any of it. They were not performing a love story. They were just two people who had found each other in a hard place and decided, carefully and then completely, that the finding was worth keeping. Old Marsh, who had seen a great deal in 65 years, said to Denny one April evening, "You remember what you said in the bunkhouse, about Mr. Vega and Miss Holt?" Denny went slightly red. "I remember." "You weren't wrong," Marsh said. "You were just early." Denny thought about that. "Is that good?" Marsh watched the two of them across the yard, Emmeline standing by the corral fence, Raphael coming out of the barn, the particular way they oriented toward each other without drama or performance, like 2 points on a compass that had found their direction. "Yes," Marsh said, "that's good." One evening in late April, as the last light was leaving the mesa, and the creek was loud with snowmelt, and the air smelled of new grass and dust, and the particular mineral sweetness of warm spring stone, Emmeline and Raphael sat on the porch of the main house. Her father was inside, reading. The hands were at the bunkhouse. The night was coming in slowly, the sky going from pale gold to deep blue above the eastern ridge. He had his notebook on his knee. He was drawing the mesa again, or rather, he was drawing the ranch, the whole of it from the porch vantage, the barn and the cottonwood in the south pasture, and the fence lines going out in all directions, and the mesa behind it all. She was watching him draw, sitting close, their shoulders almost touching. "You're putting me in it," she said, noticing a small figure in the sketch, near the barn. "I put you in everything I draw of this place," he said, without looking up. "You're in the ranch, the way the rock is in the mesa. You can't draw it honestly without you." She looked at the sketch for a long moment, at the small figure, at the careful lines of the fence and the barn and the great flat face of the mesa behind it all. "Raphael," she said. He looked up. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I want you to answer honestly, not carefully." "All right," he said. "Do you want to stay?" He looked at her. The evening was very still. She held his gaze and did not qualify the question or take it back. "Yes," he said, immediately, without the careful weighing she had expected, just the word, solid and plain as the mesa behind them. "Then stay," she said, "not as a hand, as stay." He was quiet for a moment, and she let him be, because this was what her father had meant about patience with things that had been taken away from people. The extra moment needed to believe that solid things were actually solid. Then he reached over and took her hand, held it, and looked back out at the ranch, their ranch, the word forming in both their minds without either of them speaking it yet, but there, solid, possible, and the mesa beyond it, turning from red to gold to the deep violet of evening. "I'll stay," he said. The stars appeared above the eastern ridge, one by one, the way they always did. The creek ran. The cattle were quiet in the lower pasture. Her father's lamp burned in the sitting room window. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. The night came in over the mesa, slow and enormous, and full of the kind of peace that is not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of something solid enough to hold against it. And in Red Rock Crossing, in the New Mexico Territory, in the year 1882, two people who had been alone for a long time stayed on a porch and watched the stars come out and knew, finally and without qualification, that this, the ranch, the land, the honest and difficult and specific life of it, was where they both belonged. The end. Or rather, the beginning of everything that came after, which was not without its trouble, as good things seldom are, but which held, as she had said it would, as he had promised it would. It held. Epilogue. 5 years later, on a summer evening in 1887, a traveler stopped at the Holt Ranch asking for water and directions. He was from back east, heading to Santa Fe, and he had the look of someone for whom the West was still a new and somewhat overwhelming thing. He was met at the gate by a tall woman in a practical braid and a man who came from the barn when he heard the horse, wiping his hands on a cloth and settling a hat on his head with the economy of someone who had worn a hat all his life. Behind them, the ranch was busy and clean new fence posts that hadn't been there in the original construction, an expanded barn, a kitchen garden along the south wall of the house. On the porch, an older man sat in the early evening, shade with a book open on his lap. The traveler got his water and his directions and thanked them. "Good ranch you have here," he offered, looking around. The woman looked at the man, and the man looked at the woman, and between them passed the particular look of people who have built something together and know the full weight of what it cost and what it gave back. "Yes," she said, "it is." The traveler rode on. The mesa caught the last gold of the afternoon. The creek ran below the southern pasture. The cottonwood stood by the old grave, broad and green in its summer fullness, older and more certain with every year. And in Red Rock Crossing, in the long amber evening of a New Mexico summer, the Holt Ranch was lit and working and alive, and two people who had found each other in the difficult, honest way, slowly, truthfully, with their eyes open, were exactly where they had chosen to be. Which is the only place worth being. The end.